Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to show you how to deploy your local Python v2 Azure functions into the cloud. So if you remember from the first video, we had two HTTP functions that we created locally via Python here, the Python v2 model. We had two blob storage triggers. And if you're unfamiliar with the first video, I will link it in the description below. Definitely check it out before you go into part 2 here if you want to see what these are and how we tested these locally. We also created an additional HTTP function via a blueprint here. I'll show you how to deploy all these to the cloud, all the different deployment options you can do to deploy it to the cloud. Then also how to configure some additional things like in your host.json file that will apply to all of your functions. And then once it's in the cloud, you'll be able to see them all here. I'll show you how to configure the environment variables so they're all run and set up correctly. I'll show you how to set up authentication so you further secure your Azure functions. I'll show you how to link an application insights to your Azure functions for additional insights and diagnostics when your functions are running. And then we'll actually go over the different key options, right? So system keys, host keys, function keys. I'll show you how that all works. Then I'll show you how to actually run your functions when they're in the cloud. And then lastly, I will show you how to actually check all the logs to be able to see all of your custom logging that you did. We set up locally and everything. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before we can actually deploy our functions to the cloud, there's a couple of Azure resources you need to create beforehand. The first one is a function app. And the reason this is the case is because if you see here in our actual code here, locally that we have set up, we have a function app that we create locally here. Right, and then we create our functions and then use them within this function app. When we actually want to deploy our functions to the cloud, we have to tell Azure what function app we actually want to deploy it to, because otherwise it doesn't know where to actually deploy this code. So that's why we have to create that function app beforehand. And there's different plan options, right, for a function app. And all kind of function apps are essentially hosted on an app service plan. And in this video, we'll be using the consumption plan. And this plan is typically only charged when the function app runs. And you also get some free grants like free execution time, total executions. So it's essentially free for some small dev testing, which is pretty nice. There's also a couple different premium plan options that are available. These come with like pre-warned workers, like for example, when your code can almost instantaneously run when you run your function versus having to take time to warm up your Python workers. More powerful instances, network security like VNet integration. There's also a dedicated app service plan. This is essentially when you want to deploy your function app into an already existing app service plan. So this is typically used when you have an existing app service plan that you're underutilizing the resources for. So you're getting billed every month for an app service plan, but not utilizing the full resources. So you actually deploy your function app into that existing plan already, so you don't just waste costs unnecessarily. Second thing you have to deploy is a storage account. And again, this has to be a general purpose storage account that supports blobs, queues, and table storage. It's not like a blob only storage. The reason is because the endpoints of the storage account are used by the function app and functions in different ways. So for example, the blob endpoint of the storage account is used by default to actually store your function app keys, like your function, host, system keys. We'll actually get into these keys a little bit later, but that's used for that. Then the other endpoints are used by the function app in different ways, which is why you need that general purpose storage account. The last thing you can deploy is the application insights. This is optional and not required. This actually provides you additional insights and diagnostics into your function app. So what actually happens is application insights can receive data from the function app and then generate some really unique insights for you, like failure anomalies. So like if it can help detect failure patterns in your function app, or smart detection rules, and there's different things you can do. And I'll show you a little bit of those as we go into this video, but I highly recommend you deploy this, but again, it's optional if you want to. Now, how do we actually deploy this code to the cloud? So I'm back in Visual Studio Code here. I actually created a PowerShell script called deploy function resources.ps1, and I will link this GitHub repository in code in the description below. So if you want to run this script, you can find it and use it if you want to as well. Now, what this script does is it actually uses Azure CLI commands. That's what this AZ and then so on does. If you're unfamiliar with the Azure CLI, it's just a command line interface to be able to work with Azure using the command line. And I'll link a description of how to install it in the video here as well. And if you want to use this script, the first thing you would do is open up a terminal here and then do AZ login. Once you install the Azure CLI, if you don't have it installed already, then we'll take you to a new page to sign into Azure. Then once you're signed in, then you can deploy this stuff to your subscription or whatever you need to. Just make sure though that you change the resource names here. Some of these resources have to be globally unique. So if you get an error or anything, just make sure you change these when you deploy them. But essentially, the script does the following things. It creates a resource group, right? It's going to be called rg-myfunc1, a new general purpose storage account, new func storage 111, a new function app, and then it's going to be the East US region. And essentially, it deploys, right, the resource group, storage account, creates the function app in the consumption plan that I was mentioning, and the Python runtime version 3.10. If you're using 3.11 of Python, you can use that instead. And then if you see here, the operating system type has to be Linux. So when you deploy Python functions into Azure, you're not able to use the Windows operating system. You have to use a Linux operating system. And it links that storage account to the function app. Then, when you actually deploy this, to actually run a PowerShell script, if you're curious, what you can do is cd, right, change directory, and go into the folder where the script is. So I'm in this deploy resources here, and then do ls if you're in PowerShell, or list if you're in Linux. And you'll see this is listed here. And then to run the PowerShell script, simply just run this, where you do this dot, which just means start in the current directory I'm in, this deploy resources, / and then go to and type in the script name, hit enter, and then it'll run the script and deploy those things. So let's actually take a look at what happens when we deploy it. So if you go to the resource group, this is actually what gets deployed. So if you see, we have our app service plan, we have our function app. Now we have our app insights, and then these two things are this is a action group. These are automatically created by the application insights when you deploy it. It's an action group and then an alert rule. And I'll get into this in a little bit once we go into the app insights. But if you don't see these two resources right away, don't worry. It sometimes takes 5 or 10 minutes for them to get configured and created here. So just take a little bit of time there. So let's actually go into our app service plan here. So if you see here, again, it's on the consumption plan. And this Y1 just means that it's a consumption pricing plan. So it's the consumption, again, plan that we're using. And then if you see here, we have apps here. So again, how this works is this app service plan is going to host our actual function app, which is why it's listed here. Now, if we go into our function app, you'll see a couple of things. Again, it's on the consumption, right? App service plan is where it's being hosted on. Each function app gets its own URL, right? This is used for HTTP triggers and different kinds of options and stuff that you do in your function app, and I'll show you that a little bit later in the video here. And then you can also see, we'll go to the environment variables. So these are the app settings. So these are really important. So let me actually show you what these values are. This first one is the App Insights instrumentation key. This is how your function app gets linked to that application insights. So the function app can then send the application insights data, and App Insights can generate those unique failure detections and different patterns there. And this value is actually the instrumentation key. So if you go to our actual App Insights, it's this instrumentation key is what that value is. You can also update it to use the connection string, but I just have it for the instrumentation key for this video here. And the next thing you want to look at is this Azure Web Job Storage. Now this defaults to our new func storage 111, that new storage account that we created, and it uses the account key, right, to connect to it, right, to send those function keys and everything that I was mentioning in those different endpoints. And now if you remember locally, when we set it up, we use the Azure right emulator, the storage emulator. When you actually deploy to the cloud, it'll use that storage account that you've connected to it. And you can change this if you need to. It uses the Python runtime. And then if you see these two app settings will actually get updated later on when we deploy our function, so I won't worry about these right now. Another really, really important thing is if you go back to our local settings here, if you see, this has our Azure Web Jobs feature flag enable organizing. This is telling our local setup here that we're actually using the Python v2 model, not the v1 model. So this actually never gets deployed to the cloud directly. You actually have to create this, right? So we actually want to go, before you deploy your functions to your function app, you actually want to add this app setting. This is, again, telling Azure and the cloud here that we're using the Python v2 model, not the v1 model. So you want to add this here, right, and apply it here. And then when you go back in the overview, you then want to restart your function app to make sure everything gets recached and everything there. Then that will then be set up there to then deploy your code to it. Okay, now the next couple things I want to show you really fast is these application insights. So again, application insights has this smart detection feature listed here. It's just one of the things that it can do. If you go to the settings here, you'll see that there's different smart detection rules that you can enable, right? For example, if the app insights detects that there's potential security issues or memory leaks or slow server response times, it can send users a notification, right, saying, "Hey, something's going on with your function app. Please, someone check this out, or might want to take a look at this." Now, how do you set up who it's actually going to be sending these notifications to if it detects this? That's where this action group comes into play. So this is actually set up, automatically again by application insights by default. And it sets up this smart detection kind of action group. And anyone who's a monitoring contributor RBAC role or monitoring reader RBAC role, right, are set up to get notifications, right, for those rules that you set up, that you enable, and then set the alert rule to get sent to, right, this action group. So this is set up to have like an email sent to these people that are in these two particular RBAC roles. Um, you can set up other, text messages and stuff and different things, but that's what this kind of does here. You can disable this or like delete it. You don't have to have it, but just kind of deploy it automatically for you. This last piece here is a alert rule. So if you go into this, right, this actually will configure the failure anomalies. So this is actually a machine learning like algorithm, right, that helps detect failure patterns in your function app. So if your function app is like failing over and over, something's really going wrong with it, it can actually set up failure anomaly rules, right, and kind of rules to then send communication to saying, "Hey, you should check out what's going on here with this function app." And if you see, it'll actually send it to that action group that I just showed you, to those users in those two roles. So that's how this kind of works. I won't go too much more into this, but if you want to look it up, you can. You can also disable this or delete it again. It's okay. But yeah, that's kind of the initial resources now that we have set up. So now in the next part, we'll actually be deploying our actual functions into the cloud and then going from there. So now that we have the prerequisite Azure resources created, like the function app and the storage account, now we actually want to publish our local setup to the cloud. So what are options to do this with Python functions? So the first way and recommended way by default is this remote build. So essentially what happens is when you use core tools, which is that command line extension, command line interface in Visual Studio Code, or the Visual Studio Code extension, it uses this by default. Now what happens is your Python dependencies, so like let's say you have pandas, numpy, any packages you have in Python, are obtained remotely based on the contents of the requirements.txt file. So what that means is whatever you have listed in your requirements.txt file here, right? So if we had like pandas, right, or whatever we had, what's going to happen is when you run this remote build command, it uses the open source Microsoft repository Oryx. And what Oryx does is it actually does build images. Essentially, it's going to kind of analyze that code base and then see your requirements.txt file. It's going to pip install all those packages that you have there, and then actually build and then deploy your code to the cloud. Right? Just kind of a high-level, quick architecture. This build image that it creates essentially just installs the Python version that you're using. It creates the full build image, right? And then it kind of creates everything, copies everything, builds the final image produced, and then runs it. You'll see what this looks like in the logs after we do this, but just kind of from a high level there. Now, the next thing to note is if you're using Linux, so if you're using Linux locally, 2 additional application settings in Azure might be created in your function app. And that's this enable Oryx. Again, just saying that it wants to use the Oryx build to true. It's defaulted there on Windows, but not in Linux. So that's why it might add this, right, to make sure that it does that for you. And this SCM do build during deployment, that's what's using the Kudu. It's KUDU service, just as extra configuration and helpful to actually deploy stuff to the cloud. So you don't have to worry too much about it. Just wanted to note that if you see that, if you're a Linux user. The second option is a local build. So this is actually where dependencies are obtained locally, based again on that requirements.txt file, right? They're actually downloaded and installed locally. So instead of using a remote build image with Oryx, it actually will install everything locally, right, to your computer, and then will deploy locally from your computer to Azure. Now this means there's a larger deployment package. I typically would not use this unless you absolutely have to. I would typically use a remote build is what I would recommend. Another option is a custom dependency build. This is if you created your own Python packages, or there's packages not found on the Python package index, right, that's publicly available. Then you kind of have to use, you have to kind of put them in this double under app, double under Python packages folder in this path, then install them locally first and use the no build option. It's a little bit more complex, but again, just want to note that if you have custom packages that aren't publicly available, you have to use this route. The other option too is that if you have a custom package index, so if your company, let's say, uses a custom like Anaconda, let's say, distribution, right, where it has its custom packages, not using the public Python package index, then you can add an extra index URL if needed, this custom dependency. I'll put a link in the description for this, but I won't go into it too much here. The last option is with Azure pipelines, right? This is like more of like automated pipelines. It's useful for like production workloads and for kind of CI/CD workflows, to kind of potentially update and deploy resources and stuff. If anyone's curious on how to do this, let me know, and I might make a video on how to create Azure pipelines with Azure functions. But I won't go into that just for the sake of time in this video. Now, what actually happens? How do we actually deploy this, and how do we use these commands here? So, if you go back into Visual Studio Code, most important thing you want to do is make sure you can actually get into your function app. So if I was going to do this, and I was actually going to run the first command that's actually going to use the remote build and deploy, right, is this func. What this is this is the func. This is that, again, that function command line interface that I used in the first video, which again, I'll link in the description below if you're not sure what this is. It says go to Azure, deploy the function app, publish it. And actually, my function app, right, that's in Azure is this myfunc app 111. So it's going to then go and grab all of my functions, right, and then deploy them to the cloud, right? This is going to be the remote build, okay? Now, one thing to note, if you try to do this and you get an error, then I'm going to show you here, unable to find project root, it's because you're not actually in it can't find this host.json or this function app file. So what you have to do is do ls for list and then cd into your actual function to project, right? And then when you can see it, right, you want to be able to see this host.json and function app. If you can see those, then you're okay. All right, and then what you want to do is then publish. And again, this is using the remote build. And I'm going to kind of show you what actually happens when you do this. So essentially, if you see, it's going to update some of those app settings that I told you in Azure. It's going to remove this because it's not needed, right? Because see, we're using a Python, right, deployment. It's going to remove this as well. And then if you see here, it created this .python_packages folder for us. But if you see, nothing's in there because we're using the remote build, right? It's doing that for us, which is perfectly fine. It just kind of creates this for us, kind of like as a temporary piece kind of there. Then you see it's collecting the Azure functions. Again, that's from that requirements.txt file. So the pip install there. And then essentially just does this remote build. And then it shows that it succeeded. So again, it deployed everything into Azure. All right, so if you see here, it deployed all of our functions. So if we actually go now and refresh our function app here, you'll see that it deployed all of our 5 functions here. Now, what if you, just to show you the difference here, if you did a local build, right, you have this flag, this build and then space and then local. So with this one, I'll just show you the difference here. Because again, there's nothing listed here. If we did a local build, it's going to do the same thing, except it's actually going to install and deploy everything from our local computer. So if you see here, it's going to delete if it finds this .python_package here, right? It's going to kind of create a new one for us here. And now if you see, it's actually going to do the same thing. It goes to requirements.txt file. But the main difference is that if you see here, this is all local stuff here. This is all locally where it's doing this pip download. And now if you go into this, before, remember with the remote load, nothing was there, remote build. But now if you see, everything's going to be here. It's actually going to package up all of our kind of Azure function stuff that's needed for this project and then deploy it. That's why it's a much larger deployment to Azure, and I wouldn't recommend doing it because it adds a bunch of extra files and stuff that you don't need on your site. Again, it will still upload and it still works and everything. So that's great. Now, next thing, go back into your function app, right? And what you just want to make sure, because sometimes on the first build it will do this. After that, it shouldn't do it, but just make sure, go back into your environment variables and make sure that your web jobs feature flag is still there. If it's not, make sure to re-add it. And again, it's supposed to show enable worker indexing. So yeah, now the next piece is that we'll actually go into these functions and I'll show you how to run them from the cloud, how the actual keys work and everything there. So now their functions are deployed to the cloud. How do we actually run them? So if you see here, we have 3 HTTP functions, and then we have 2 blob functions, which I'll show a little bit later of how to use. But first for the HTTP functions, how do we actually run these now that we're in the cloud? So this is how it works. The first part is this URL. So this is now the app function URL that you're going to use as your starting endpoint, right? Every app function, every function app when you deploy it gets its own URL. This function app 101.azurewebsites.net. Now, how does this work? So let's say we want to call our additional HTTP functions. Now let's take a quick step back before this into Visual Studio Code. And if you see here, when it actually deployed, it says, hey, you can now invoke these URLs using that new cloud, right, URL with the endpoint. So if you go to this brand new route, again, that's that blueprint one that I created earlier with this brand new route here. Now, really, really important to note about keys. Okay, so if you see here, I don't have an auth level defined. If I go to my first function here, if you see I have an auth level called anonymous. What this means that no API key is required to call this HTTP function, right? This function app, this particular function. That means that anyone can kind of call this. No API key is needed. Now, by default, if you don't specify an auth level, it defaults to use the function key, which I'll explain in just a second. But I just want to show you this because if you see there's no auth level defined, you're just going to use the function key, meaning that I have to actually pass it a key in order to call it. So if I try to run this first one, right, this additional HTTP function, here it's going to fail and say the page isn't working right now. It's an error, right? Now, if I use the one where I do have an anonymous, so no API key was required, right? In my first HTTP function, I hold Control, left click, hit open here, it actually works, right? So if you see that error, it's because you don't have your auth level defined. Now, when you test locally, by default, all auth keys are disabled because you don't have them yet, right? You haven't deployed to the cloud because you're just testing locally, right? Even now, you can still test locally with this. But when you actually use the cloud version, when you deploy to the cloud, auth keys do take effect. So just to note, if your thing doesn't work, that's why, is because of this auth level there. Now, how do auth keys actually work? So we go back to the cloud. All right, there's a couple different sets of auth keys, okay, and function keys. So the first one are system keys. Okay, system keys are really just designed for extension-specific function endpoints that get called internally. So two of our functions call a blob container, right? They bind to a blob, so it creates this blob's extension key for us automatically. If you use like durable functions or event grid triggers, right, it could create additional system keys for you. Again, these are called internally. We don't have to worry about these too much right now. The second set is host keys. So these two keys can be used to call any function. So example, this default key, this key here, which I'll show you how it works when you call it. But you can use this key to call any of those 5 functions that I showed. So any of the HTTP functions, any of the blob functions, this works for all functions in your function app. I would not give this key out unless you really, really need to. I really wouldn't do that too much. Now this master key is also a host key, so it can be used for all functions in your function app. But this master key actually gives additional admin access to runtime REST APIs and some configuration. So do not give out this key unless you absolutely have to. So this is additional permissions on top of being able to run all the functions. And again, you can create new host keys if you need to. Now the next kind of level is function keys. So if you go to any particular function, so let's go to this additional HTTP function, and you go to function keys, you see we also have a default key here. Now this function key is specifically scoped to only be able to use with this additional HTTP function. You can't use this key with any other function in your function app. It's only going to be used for this, right? For this one. You can create a new function key if you want to, right? If you want to create a new name and stuff. Now how do you run this in the cloud, right? With this new URL. So you can go to this code and test, get the function URL, and there's 2 ways to do this. When you have with the auth level set as function key or higher, right? So this particular function key, right, gives you the master host key, because again, any of these keys can be used. Now, if I go to the function key, I can copy this here, go to a new tab, I'm going to paste this in. Let's actually go over what this is doing. So what it's doing, it's actually calling that endpoint again that I mentioned. This brand new route, which again was that endpoint that we gave it in our code here, right, with the route. And then it has this question mark code. So this is actually a URL parameter, okay? And this is saying I'm going to pass in the function key here. This is one way to run this function, okay? Is you this question mark code equals and then the actual function key. And if you see here, these percents are escaped because it's in the URL of the query, right? So you don't have to worry too much about it. If you just grab and copy it, it'll do it for you automatically. So then if I run this, you'll see that it worked. Okay. Now, if you remember, in another function, we actually can pass in a name. Okay, so how does that work with this? So if you see here, right, I'm going to go and this is the second HTTP function. I'm going to get this. Okay, I'm going to copy this function key again. Okay, I go in here, paste it in. It's going to say, hello, so glad this worked. Now, how do we add the name? Remember, we can add additional name parameter. So how does that work? So you can either do it in two ways. You could do it in this question mark. You could say name equals Nick, and then do this and as a separator, and then pass in your function key, right? So hello, Nick. The other option is you can also do it at the end. So I can still pass in my code and then do this and then name equals, let's say, Sally. And it'll pass in Sally. And again, if I don't give it anything, it will still give it this regular, right, defaulted message here. Now, what's the other option to do it? If you don't want to pass it in the URL, which I typically don't, I usually want to pass it, you can actually pass it in as an HTTP header. So how that works is you can actually go to your function key here, right? And you want to copy this function key. And again, there's no percents here because this isn't escaped because we're going to use this as an HTTP header. Very important here. Now if we go, I can actually go into Thunder Client. And I use this brand new route. Again, still pasting that in. And Thunder Client is just an extension of Visual Studio Code to allow you to call HTTP requests. You use Postman or like whatever one you're familiar with, but I'm just using one here. And then what you do is you paste in your actual, you create this HTTP header. So in this headers tab, you have to create this X hyphen functions hyphen key. Meaning then you pass in the value is actually your function key. Okay. And then when you run this, oops, I'm using the additional HTTP one. So that's this one, this new route. Okay. And then you can do that, right? And then again, I could pass in like name equals Nick, right? And it'll say, hello, Nick. So glad this function worked. But you see, I don't have to pass the function key in the actual URL. I could put it in this header that's used right here. So just another way to do it. Those are kind of the two ways of how to do it there. So now, one more thing to note about auth levels and keys is that there's three different types you can define, right, for your HTTP function. So the first one is anonymous that we have here. That means that no API key is required. You can just essentially anyone can run this function. I don't recommend doing this. Just want to show you this as an example. Then the other two are function. Our function. And this is where the actual specific function key is required. The last one is admin, and that's where the actual master key is required. So by default, again, it uses the function auth level if you don't define it here. Otherwise this, and again, this has to be used by the master key only is able to use to call this function that I showed you earlier in the master key. So yeah, so let me know about HTTP functions. How do the blob functions work in the cloud? So let's actually go back here. And if you see here, I'm in my storage account, and I created a container called new container. And really quick, just to mention, remember that blob endpoint that I mentioned that it stores your function keys by default? So actually go into those WebJav secrets, you'll see your function app listed here, then all of your functions, even your host.json. And you'll see, like, for example, this additional HTTP function, you'll see the different keys set up here, right? So this is the default key. Now these are encrypted, so it'll be a different value, but just at least to note that that's what that is. Encryption is true. So yeah, I just want to mention that. Now, If you see, I create a new container and I upload a file called people.csv. Now that's going to hit this blob function, right? This one right here. We're in a new container, a people.csv file. Once it's uploaded, it's going to trigger this. And it's going to show, hey, this file is uploaded, so cool, right? That's what we want to do in the logs. So how does this work? So once I uploaded this, what you can do is you can go into your function app. So let me show you here. Let me go back here. Okay, and you can go to your first blob function, right? Because that's one that's going to get hit. You can go into it, and you can click on this tab called Invocations. Okay, this is going to show you like how many times it succeeded, how many times it failed, all this stuff, right? You see, I tested this a couple times, but if you just go into one of these here, right, you can see that you'll see the logs here, right, and you'll see that the custom login that we set up, right, is going to show up here. You can even run this in Application Insights. This will bring up the logs here, and then run this KQL query. It's custom query language. I won't go into that, but some custom stuff you can do. But if you see here, it will actually show all the logs and everything that you have. So so kind of there is how that works. Okay, so now that we went over the main stuff for the functions, I want to show you a couple of advanced configuration and a couple of advanced things you can do really quickly to kind of help you out and maybe secure some of your Azure functions a little bit more and stuff. Now, if you remember our first blob function, right, and I'll kind of knock this out in two pieces here at the same time. So if you see here, in our first blob function, right, we're connecting to our Azure Web Job Storage account, right? It's going to look for that people.csv in this connection that is listed here. And if you remember, that connection, right, is this one here. That's our default new func storage 111. But what if you actually want to split that up, right? You might not want your blob functions to be triggered in the same storage account that stores your function keys and all that. You might want a different storage account for it, right? So I'll show you how to do that. And on top of that, if you also notice, how this function app is connecting to this storage account is with the account key, right? That's listed up here, right? Now, what if you're in a coffee shop, right, and someone's walking by and sees your account key, right, and they grab it, or because this is just there, if someone accidentally has access to this and can see that account key, then they now have access to your storage account using that account key, right? That's not good. So what you want to do is actually create you can actually use an identity to connect to the storage account from your function app instead of an actual account key. And I actually use that so I don't have these things just floating around, listed here. So to do that, this is how you do it, right? It just secures things a little bit more. You don't have to hard code your account keys in there. So to be able to do this, here's how you do it. So the first thing you do is you want to go in the settings here under this identity blade. Now you want to actually turn on the system assigned managed identity. Now, what this does is this system assigned managed identity gives this function app its own identity. Okay, so if we refresh, you'll see it creates a object in Microsoft Entra, right, for this particular function app. Okay, and what's nice about system assigned managed identities is they're tied to this specific resource, meaning that if we delete this function app at any point later on, then this identity in Microsoft Entra, this managed identity, also gets deleted along with it. And now we can actually assign permissions and RBAC roles to this function app, to this identity now, for this function app, and it can do those things and connect via the identity versus that account key. Okay. The next thing you want to do is back in our local setup here, right? If you want to test this locally first, what we can do is we'll create an additional connection called additional storage. Right, and again, if you want to test this locally, you can still again use the emulator, right, and just use that here, right, and just apply that there. But then what we want to do is we want to take this connection. This is going to be the environment variable, right, and then we want to add it here, okay, to the connection. So instead of connecting to that original storage account, we want to connect to this new storage account. Okay, and then what you can do is then you can actually run and publish this. Now I've already done this, so I won't take up your time republishing it, but I've already published it to the cloud with this setting there. Okay, now once you're back in the cloud, the next thing you want to do is now that we have the identity set up for the function app, we now want to add that connection here so our function app can connect to that storage account. Now to do so and not use the account key, this is how you can do it. You can actually set up two environment variables, two app settings here. Now the first one is this additional storage double under blob service URI. And again, this additional storage is what we named it right here. So if you named it something else, you'd use that piece. And then you use this double underscore blob service URI. Now this means that this is now going to allow the function app to connect to the blob service endpoint, to the blob endpoint, right? Because we're using a blob trigger. And what the value is if you see here, I created a new storage account called new func storage 222. Okay, we actually go into settings here, click on endpoints, and you'll see that there's different endpoints to the different like endpoints of the storage account, right? Like the blob service, file service, queue service, and so on. So if you go to the blob service here, you can actually copy this endpoint, okay? Add it here, right? Remove that slash there, okay? And now the second thing that's really, really important you want to add is the queue endpoint as well. The reason being is that when blob triggers fail, right? What typically happens is there's what's called a poison blob that gets written to the queue of the storage account. So the queue endpoint of the storage account, when like your blob trigger fails, just saying, hey, something went wrong. This is the failure here to this particular queue. So you actually have to add that as well. That's really, really important, or your functions may not work correctly for your blob functions when you do this. So how you do that is you add this additional storage, double under, and then now we're going to connect to the queue service. Okay, so then we go to the queue service here, grab this endpoint here. Okay, we go back. Okay, and now so now we're connected to the blob and queue. So we can write those poison blobs, right, whenever failures happen on the blob triggers, and a regular blob endpoint. Okay, now what you can do is confirm this. Okay, and then back in your Azure function, you want to restart. Whenever you do any stuff like that, you always want to restart this. Okay, and once this comes up, you want to restart it. And now what you need to do is now that your function app has its own identity, okay, you now need to add it to the storage account to be able to connect to it to give it permission with the identity piece control. Okay, and then you add. Okay, now for our blob trigger, all we're doing is we're reading a file, right? So for example, in our blob trigger, all we're doing is just going to read the file, then just print the name of the blob path. So we're not having to write anywhere, right? So all we need is a storage blob data reader RBAC role. Okay, that will give us enough permissions for this one. But if you're actually in your functions writing to the blob, right, reading, writing, or deleting stuff, then you need this storage blob data contributor RBAC role instead. But for our purposes, we can just do this. Next, click on Manage Identities, right? Find your function app, right? Right? And then review and assign, and then assign it. Now I've already added this, right? Sometimes, it might not do it. So yeah, now it added it there for us. Okay, now the second thing you want to do is remember we have that queue piece, right, for those poison blobs to write to the queue. So you also have to make sure that you add the queue contributor role. Okay, and it's this storage queue data contributor, right? This allows you to read, write, and delete storage queues and queue messages. Okay, that's really, really important. So then you want to also add our function app to that, right? Okay, now that that's assigned, now our function app has enough permissions to be able to connect to that storage account, right? Using its own identity, right? And then connect to those two, right, endpoints that we see here, right? So yeah, now that that's set up, to show you what that looks like after the fact, right? If we go back to our functions here, I'll go to my first blob function. I'll go to invocations. And if you remember before, it only had the success of 2, right? So now when I added that third file, right? So I created this, again, a new container in it, uploaded the people.csv file, and then it actually wrote, right, that third one and succeeded there using the actual identity now, not the account key anymore. So yeah, that's kind of how that works there. The last piece I wanted to show you here is how to actually set up authentication on your HTTP functions, right? So what this means is you can go to the settings blade here, click on authentication. If you see, you can add an identity provider. This will actually help secure your HTTP functions if you want to use this route. So just one way is to do that. So you can add an identity provider. Let's say you want to add Microsoft. Okay, what's essentially going to happen is it's going to create a new app registration called myfuncapp111, right? And it's going to say in this current tenant, and allow requests from the application itself, right? So it's going to use this kind of application to be able to help authenticate users, right, and log users in and stuff in a way. So let me show you what that means, right? It says require authentication, right? It means that request to your app include information about the caller, maybe like additional calls. So let me show you what this means here. So let me add this. A couple of things are going to happen. Okay, it's going to add this new app ID here, right? My Funk app 111, right? New app registration. Now it's going to require authentication. That means that users have to actually sign into Azure before they can run your Azure functions, right? Your HTTP functions first. So the other thing that it does too is it also will add two additional app settings here, right? This is the secret value of that app registration, right? And then this is the tenant. It's going to show your current tenant they're going to be using in that setting that we had enabled there. Now, so let me show you how this works, right? So what you can do, okay, so how that works is you go into the access, so you actually go, let's say we want to run one of our functions, okay? Let's say we want to run this second HTTP function. So how this works, if you remember before, we were just able to use the right function key and we paste it in a browser. But now here's what's going to happen. Because I'm already signed into Azure, right? What I'm going to do is go into a private window here. And then I'm going to paste, right, that same one, right, that we should be able to use. But now if you see, what it's going to ask for, it's going to ask us to sign into our account, an Azure account first, right? So we actually have to authenticate and actually sign into Azure before we can even run these HTTP functions. So yeah, just kind of another way to help secure your HTTP functions, and just wanted to show you that. So hopefully this whole video has been helpful and got you set up and able to help deploy Azure functions locally to the cloud and get everything set up. So if you have any comments or anything, please let me know in the comment section. Thank you.